the stars be with you.
All right, I am so happy to welcome this week's special guest and my personal mentor, Kelly Surtees. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Mel. It's a pleasure. I'm really excited to talk with you today.
Yes, the feeling is mutual. So before we get started here, in case people haven't heard of you before, which they all should, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Gosh, well, I'm Australian, which will be obvious by my accent, although I have lived in Canada now for 10 years. I moved here because I fell in love and I'm now married to my husband, and he's Canadian. So that's a little on the personal side. So I guess I sound like a mashup. When I'm in Australia, I don't sound Australian enough, but when I'm in Canada or the States, I don't sound anything like a North American. But astrology, I guess, is what we're all connecting through this shared love of. And I started studying astrology when I was 11, self-taught at home under the big maple trees in Sydney, reading books like an absolute spooky nerd. And when I was in my early 20s, I took I studied for a solid couple of years with an astrology teacher in Sydney, and then started seeing clients. And that was nearly 20 years ago now.
Oh, wow.
And astrology has been my life work, I guess. I've been very sort of lucky and privileged that my love for astrology has kind of paid off. And now I guess I travel the world teaching astrology, seeing clients, and it's really great. Astrology is such an amazing tool, and I love teaching students, and I love especially working with clients. So these are my great loves.
Oh, well, they're fabulous things, and you've definitely made something, you've carved your own niche out of it all. And I have that's not even a word. I have dove into the niche that you have carved, and I think you have a lot to share, and I'm so glad that you took that leap. And it's so funny, before we got on here, I realized Kelly and I are around the same age, and to think about how much longer you've been pursuing this, I envy that, to some extent, being able to no, you're like, yeah, this, I'm going to go for this.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that I would necessarily recommend that people did what I did, but not that I think I did anything wrong, but when I look back, I think, gosh, I was 22 or 23 when I saw my first client, and I was just so excited about the power of astrology and what astrology could offer. And I had already done training in remedial massage therapy, so I had that as a skill. And very shortly after starting to see clients, I did go and do a training program in holistic counseling. So that was a great thing that I could add in to my work. But yeah, I think if you lucky enough to work with something you love and you do it for all day, every day, month in, month out, year in, year out, it just kind of, especially this type of work, it becomes fully sort of embedded and integrated within you. And I always say astrology rewards what you put into it, basically.
Yeah. And I mean, now I put a lot into it, obviously, and you're absolutely right. Every day it surprises me. It's just pure magic in many ways. So I'm glad, I'm right there with you. I love to talk about it and, pursue it as well, because it's just a mystery that never ends, and I love it. Says the Scorpio rising. Okay. So.
Oh, yes, totally.
So what are we talking about today? Well, I thought that Kelly would be perfect to come on to talk about this Venus retrograde cycle. So we're going to be talking about Venus retrograde from Scorpion to Scales, since we're about to have Venus retrograde here shortly this week, as we're airing this a little early, but Kelly, I've already forgotten the date. October 5th.
Oh, October 5th. Yeah, October 6th in Australia. I'll just grab my October astro schedule sheet here. Yeah, Venus will station retrograde at 10 Scorpio on Friday, October 5th, late in the day in Canada and the States, and it'll be early Saturday morning if you're in Australia. So basically we get to October, another month, another retrograde.
Like we haven't had enough
year.
this year. My goodness.
Just the story of this year. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that actually. As we get started in here, just the nature of retrograde planets in transit, more so in the chart. What are your thoughts on retrograde planets in general?
Yeah, so a retrograde, I mean, it's a really special shift in a planet's cycle. It is the apparent backwards motion of a planet through the sky. So yes, we astrologers know that planets don't really go backwards, but the astrological perspective is the visual one, as if we're standing on Earth looking into the sky. And from that point of view, we do see what is the apparent backwards motion of a different planet. And so there is, all the words come out for retrograde, like repetition, redoing, reviewing, reassessing. But I also think most retrogrades are, because that it's literally a planet going over familiar territory, it's an opportunity to go back over and to then usually to go deeper with recent events. And so, often in life we think about things moving forward and it's A, B, C, D, E. But when we have a retrograde, we sit in the same spot and it's like reversing up and down the street because you forgot something and you leave and then you forgot something and you go back. There's a frustration because you're trying to get from A to B, but you get stuck in the space in between. And while to our modern mind, the idea of being stuck or treading water or standing still is a little bit frustrating, it has a purpose in the realm of the psyche, or to do with our psychology and our soul. Because the way our psyche works, it needs time where no new stuff comes in so that we can process and integrate and understand whatever's just been going on. And the whatever's just been going on with Venus retrograde can take us as far back as 8 years, depending on the way we're looking at her cycle. And so these opportunities, retrogrades, are really pivotal for reflection and for some quiet time. And the Venus retrograde is I don't know, she's my favorite retrograde out of the Mercury, Mars, or Venus, because her retrograde is the most rare. So it's the least frequent retrograde. And it is the length of time, that 40 days that Venus is retrograde, is commonly associated with that idea of like 40 days in the desert. And so the idea of retreat, or how long you need to change a habit, or going on sabbatical, that 6-week period, which is approximately 42 days, kind of ties into the Venus retrograde period. Anyway, I'm diving a little ahead because I'm so excited to talk about this. But retrograde planets, the biggest way to use a retrograde planet, if you're thinking, how is this going to affect me? There are 2 ways that you can think about this. One, think about the space in the zodiac, so the degrees in the zodiac that the planet will actually be reversing through, and whatever house that is in your chart, or if you have any planets in that particular part of the zodiac, they're going to be sort of pulled in to that planet's retrograde cycle. And the other way to think about it is via the rulership method. So in the rulership method, we look at a planet's rulership of the different houses, and the planets rule houses through the signs that you have on your house cusp. So for instance, if you have an Aries or even a Scorpio midheaven or 10th house, the Mars retrograde would have had a really strong impact on your career, because Mars is your personal career planet. So with Venus going retrograde, if you have one of Venus's signs, Taurus or Libra, maybe it's on your 11th house of friendships, then when Venus is retrograde, a lot of that stuff, reviewing, reassessing, or even reconnecting, it's a good Venus retrograde word, that's going to be applicable specifically to friendships or social groups or networks. So the other concept we get with the retrograde planets is the idea of delays, or things slowing down or hitting a bit of a bump in the road. So I do think it's important to shift our expectations around pacing and around progress. It doesn't mean everything slows down when one planet goes retrograde, but it means something in your life will. And the key is to kind of tune that retrograde into your chart For instance, for me personally, this Venus retrograde is going to happen in my 9th house of travel. And one thing I do a lot of is travel. And the last few months I don't even know where I've been half the time. There's been a lot, and it's been fun, but it's like I come home, drop my bags. I mean, I've got this whole packing business down pat. And my husband and I, we've got our routine. Okay, you're going, right, this is all the prep and all of that stuff. But with Venus retrograde in my 9th house, it's not that I won't be traveling, but actually I'm not flying. I actually do have one trip to take in this period, but I'll be going by train instead of by plane. And I'm actually really thrilled to be off the planes for a little while. So that's not necessarily going to be relevant for all of you, but if any of you have Scorpio in your 9th house, then the Venus retrograde, the slowing down or the taking a break, going on pause will be relevant to 9th house topics. So I think I might have done more than answer your question.
No, I like that. That's what I like about Kelly. She brings out all this information. You just like osmosis in. Well, luckily you will get a break, because I'm sure, traveling, it's taxing. It can take a lot out of you over a stretched out period of time. So much like you're saying with the whole idea of nature of retrograde planets, like sometimes we just need to stop moving forward in a certain area so that we can catch breath and reassess, the direction as we move forward once again there. So yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. So now let's talk about Venus. Like, what is, we know what retrograde planets are doing within relation to the planet itself. So let's talk about our planet, our gal Venus, and what does she represent?
So she is so many things. I often say this about Venus and about the moon, which are two planets that I think are completely underappreciated in modern astrology. Venus has been studied since antiquity. After the sun and moon, Venus is like the main planet that the ancients really focused on, and her cycles and her retrogrades have captured the imaginations of humans for eons. And part of that reason is that Venus is the brightest thing in the sky after the sun and moon. So she has and I always say when you're trying to get familiar with the actual sky, Venus is the planet that looks like Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. She looks exactly like you would imagine this bright celestial diamond type energy. So there's a piece there about light, but Venus's symbolism, if you like, is very much to do with the feminine version of light, or the feminine essence, or the feminine way. And so with Venus going retrograde, there's an opportunity here to kind of slow down, to explore the feminine way, which usually means moving at the pace of guidance. So that's moving at the pace of kind of your intuition or your feeling. It's a very feminine thing to say, I feel it in my waters type of thing. You've got a sense about something, even though you might not be able to logically or rationally explain it. And I always say, with the feminine energy of Venus, that applies to anyone, regardless of gender identity. There is a feminine style of doing things. And so one other key thing with Venus is to get into your inner flow, to kind of step back from, Venus can be a social butterfly. She is about unification. She likes to pull people and things together. But when she's on a break, when she's retrograde, she doesn't have as much to give to others. And it's like she's sitting in the cave on the mountain, and she's just opted to seclude or isolate herself, not permanently, but for a temporary period, to undergo a process of transformation. And we see it represented in the sky, where through her retrograde, she switches from being a morning star to an evening star, or from an evening star to a morning star. So she's visible in, say, the evening sky, and then she becomes invisible for a period of time. And that's the retrograde, where symbolically we're all in the cave. And then when she emerges, she comes out, in the morning instead of in the evening. So there's a different quality to her. So the process of Venus is really about arousing that sense of femininity, of attractiveness, of bonding. There's a lot that comes up about how you relate to other people. And there's also a lot that comes up about self-worth with Venus. What do I deserve? And, how are we expressing that? How does our sense of deservedness affect our choices in relationship? Because if you don't have a sense of being deserving, if you have a lack of self-worth and you don't think you deserve being respected or being treated, properly, then you're going to make some choices that are in line with that lack of self-worth. So there's a lot of deep layers that come up with Venus. Like we often say, oh, she's beauty and love and romance and fun and parties, but she's much more powerful, I think, than just those three or four but keywords.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I totally agree, because Venus has been one of the hardest planets to wrap my mind around in my whole astrological journey. And maybe, it actually speaks to my chart a little bit as far as why that might be. I won't digress. However, yeah, because it is. It's not as clear cut. It's much like feminine. It's like that receptivity, that power of that mystery that I was talking about.
Venus word. Yeah.
That, there's a mystery there to it. And that's the beauty, but that's also what makes it hard to kind of pin down in a way. And I found it interesting because, of course, I'm looking at tales of Venus retrograde as I prepare to talk to you, like something that might have stood out as significant to me, actually from a wonderful book by Erin Sullivan, which is about the retrograde planets. Planets in retrograde, which I'll share a link on my blog. But she was talking about how in Mesoamerica, for the Aztecs and the Mayans, they were very, keyed into the Venus retrograde cycle. And they considered it as when she was to station and go retrograde, she was in her male form, in her warrior form. And then she would get burnt by the combustion of the sun, like you're saying, where it goes into that cave and we can't see her, so that she can be, transformed and rebirthed in a way. And on the other end, when she was to station direct, she was reborn. She essentially was reborn as a female. And I just thought that was very interesting, like that process of, the male energy that is rebirth to being female, because it kind of taps into the idea of Venus and the element of the whole, like wholeness of something. Because she's known for her like diplomatic kind of qualities, right? The diplomacy of things, and Anyways, I found that interesting, Kelly.
No, it's super interesting, and it reminds me too that when you look at Venus in a birth chart, and if you can identify, if you know how to look and say, oh, this is a morning star Venus versus this is an evening star Venus, there is a very different tone. Venus morning star in a chart is much more independent. There is almost like a warrior goddess in the morning star version of Venus. She's like a feisty, independent, very sort of strong-minded version of herself. And then in the evening star, it's a little bit more typically Venusian in terms of being collaborative or open to compromise, that type of thing. So, and these are the nuances, if you like, in the Venus cycle. Erin Sullivan's book on retrograde planets is fantastic. And for people who really want to get into all the different phase versions of Venus, Adam Gainsbourg wrote a beautiful book called The Light of Venus, because, we always think about the moon having 8 different phases, and they're 8 modern phases, because to the ancients, the moon actually had about 11 phases. But Adam's identified, I think, 12 or 14. I can't remember the exact number.
13, right in the middle.
13, right, there you go, of course, the feminine number. 13 phases of Venus. So depending on, is she morning star and direct, or morning star and retrograde, how close to the sun is she, all of these different iterations. So there is so much to do with her cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was going to share that book as well. So we're totally on the same page as looking at that. And I was born during the immersion phase, which, if you think about it, like, my Venus, by progression is constantly moving towards the sun. She's going in. She's going in to meet that. And it really plays into my life, I have to say, on some level. So there was definitely some insight I got from that book. So highly recommended to, if you need a different angle to look at Venus, or any angle, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yes, so many good books. Oh my gosh.
Many good books.
Talk about Venus all night.
I know. Well, if you do have any more Venus books to share, feel free to throw them in there, because I like to, turn people on to, ways to, just learn more about things.
Well, and I think this is not explicitly a book about the planets, but Deborah Holding's book, Houses, Temples of the Sky, is so good. It should be required reading for all astrologers, basically, especially when we're pulling our understandings of things together. And she connects a little bit of the meaning of the houses to the planets that have their joy in those houses. And this is another way that has helped me really understand Venus, is that she has her joy. So she feels really comfortable in the 5th house in the chart. And the 5th house is traditionally a house of play and pleasure and romance and fertility. And so there is a part of Venus that is about enjoyment. And I always think of Venus as being about life's little luxuries. So it's, those little extra sweet things that we can add into our experience. Maybe it's a nice scarf or a comfortable pair of socks or pants, or that extra really fabulous, luxurious chocolate that you're going to treat yourself to. She is those little things that just maybe grease the wheels a bit, but add those moments of sweetness. And so I think that's part of getting to know your Venus, is getting to know what are your personal iterations of sweetness and pleasure and indulgence, and then knowing that you're worthy enough to have them. So treating yourself to those.
That last part is because we all have our own pleasure principle in some way,
Yes.
like what speaks to us. But then also, if we allow ourselves to be deserving of that, to indulge, because, Venus, it can be indulgent in some ways. And not everyone is set up. Like, I feel like I'm one of those people.
Yes.
Maybe it's the Capricorn and the Virgo and stuff, to be indulgent, less likely to do so. But I think that's where, for me at least, that Venus lesson can come in there, because we're all deserving, that's a key lesson to learn in life, especially for those who struggle with worth issues. So.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, how do you like to pamper yourself? And it looks different for everyone. Yeah. So that's an opportunity with Venus generally, but certainly Venus retro. Yeah.
Yeah. So we can look at those types of things during this cycle as well, getting in touch with, because sometimes the things that give us pleasure don't, expire. And that's the thing that I found interesting about Venus, because I was seeing her likened to, a windflower, where she, the idea of love and pleasure is going the way of the wind, because it's not guaranteed, it has its own cycle and its own life cycle there. So I'm wondering if part of the retrograde process is getting in touch with, what still gives us pleasure to some extent.
That's a really great concept, Mel, because I do think that's the whole point of a planetary retrograde, is to kind of reassess and reflect how we're using that planet in our life. And with Venus being about pleasure, it's a good time to ask yourself, is what I think will give me pleasure still giving me pleasure? Or have I kind of outgrown? Am I done with that? And is there something new that might actually satisfy me more that I need to maybe open myself up to?
Open yourself up to, because that's another thing with Venus is, you have to be open to something. She's receptive.
Yeah, she's receptive. Yeah, she is. I mean, and the feminine sort of vessel is a receptive vessel. So it's not penetrating like a Mars vessel, because the Mars vessel has more of that. Even the symbol has the arrow on it. It's that, like, I'm going out to penetrate or to pierce something, to attack with Mars as well. But Venus is, and even the idea of Venus with all her adornments, it's the makeup or the nice clothing or the beautiful perfume, or I've baked this nice meal and doesn't it smell good and taste good? And these are all ways of evoking the Venusian magnetism, because if you're a receptive vessel, you're looking to draw in. And so that's where all the adornment sort of comes from. They're tools of pulling in, tools as part of that receptive dance, if you like.
Yeah, I love it. So, all right. So we're talking about Venus here. Now let's talk about Venus retrograde in Scorpio.
Scorpios.
And then Libra, of course, but in Scorpios where we're stationing here. So what are your thoughts on Venus in her not one of her favorite signs.
No, I mean, I think, yeah, so Venus is technically in detriment in Scorpio, and it doesn't mean Venus is bad in Scorpio, but it does mean that there is a little bit of a misfit between Venus's desire to unify and bring together, and the nature of Scorpio, which is traditionally ruled by Mars and has more of that probing, truth-oriented, like obsessed with the depth at all costs almost. And so Venus in Scorpio, Venus kind of has to adopt the Scorpio way in Scorpio. That's the whole point of planets moving into different signs. So she's trying to create connection and collaboration, but she is on a mission to uncover truths or buried, hidden things. Now, those hidden things could be a type of pleasure, whether it's a sexual pleasure or just a pleasure in life. She might be wanting to uncover an emotional truth here. Now, in Scorpio, we want to know things regardless of whether knowing those things hurts us or causes a little bit of pain.
Yeah.
You know, I always think of that line from the movie, like, I want the truth. You can't handle the truth. Yeah, right?
I love it.
But in Scorpio, I mean, any planet in Scorpio can handle the truth. And the amount of time I've had a parent in my consulting room and we're looking at their child's chart and their child's got a really strong Scorpio signature, I'm like, you need to be really honest with this child, because they will pick up Venus in Scorpio, particularly. She knows what's going on. She's got a felt, visceral kind of sensation about the undercurrents. And so we're looking to try and get more conscious on the deeper waters. You know, I often think about Scorpio as like the still waters run deep.
Yeah.
And we're all going into those deeper waters. It can look very dark and murky and scary from the top looking in. Once you're in it, it can actually be a little bit more comforting than you expect, but it can certainly be quite revelatory in terms of opening you up to things that you might not have known you didn't know, but you can actually benefit from coming to understand. So Venus in Scorpio is very interested in things like loyalty, truth, and trust. So that's part of where the honesty comes from, is it's better to be upfront with Venus in Scorpio, even if it's a bit awkward. And Venus in Scorpio is going to have us talking about some of our deepest fears and vulnerabilities. We're going to be like almost piercing into what it is we think prevents us bonding, because I think Venus in Scorpio has a fear around not being able to bond as deeply or as intensely as she might like. And because we're all going to get a taste of this, we all get a chance to explore what about us do we think helps us get close to other people, but how do we sometimes get in our own way? And so there is, like, Venus is taking on a version of the warrior in Scorpio, but the warrior in Scorpio is different from the Aries Mars warrior. The warrior in Scorpio is fairly wise and knows to pause before diving in. And so the idea of exploration or investigation into the heart and into the kind of soul or the meat of relationships is a huge part of what this Venus retrograde in Scorpio is about.
Yes, all that. Well,
all those.
All of that. Well, I like.
What are your thoughts, Mel? Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to share. I shared with you right before we got on, and I actually did a little Instagram post on it, because today, as we're recording this, they're having the hearings in Washington D.C. with Ford and Kavanaugh, and Christine Ford's coming out to share things from the past that were long buried and hidden deep and are difficult to talk about, yet she's almost in some ways sacrificing herself for the good of other people, because her life has been turned around by putting out, sexual assault that happened so many years ago. And here she is, speaking on it today in a vulnerable position, because it's one thing to deal with those types of things on the inside, but once you, actually speak them and bring them out into the ether, there's a release there too. And I think that might be part of Venus and Scorpio that's going on too, if we're able to go to those depths, that release that can come out. But what I found was so interesting, because I just had a sneaking suspicion that this played into at least the political sphere, or the, kind of justice that Venus can represent, or that kind of diplomatic, signature, that at the time of as the hearing was starting at 10 a.m. in Washington, D.C., and today is September 27th, I believe, I hope so,
Yes.
that the ascendant of the moment was exactly conjunct Venus at 9 degrees Scorpio. And so I just feel like this is just one of the examples of some of the at least, world sphere that we're going to be, seeing, because this issue has been on the table for quite some time now, as Jupiter has been in Scorpio, and now we have Uranus in Taurus, which is also kind of, uprising some, feminine energy in that regard too, which is, Taurus ruled by Venus. And then Venus will make her opposition to Uranus in the retrograde cycle as well. And so I don't know, I just think this storyline is very much playing in line with a lot of maybe even what we've experienced why Jupiter was in Scorpio. Or is.
Yeah, I think you make some really good points there, Mel, about the context in which this particular Venus retrograde in Scorpio is happening. We have had Jupiter tilling the soil, if you like, working that Scorpio territory since October 2017. And that's a little unusual to have Venus retrograde in a sign where we still have Jupiter as well. And I wonder if that is adding the larger social context, if you like, to the particular themes or threads. Because Venus in Scorpio is about power imbalances and power dynamics in sexual situations. It's about power dynamics in relationship situations, but Scorpio has long had this connection to sexuality and sexual intimacy as well. And so having Jupiter there is definitely adding, maybe the justice piece or the collective kind of quality. We've also got, as you beautifully mentioned, Uranus in Taurus. And that is, Uranus in Taurus historically has triggered independence and new freedoms around women's issues and women's topics. So that is something when you look back every 82, 84 years when Uranus is in Taurus, we get these changes in society and culture that actually give women the opportunity to stand up and gain more freedom or gain more independence. And so there is an interesting sort of correlation, if you like, between having some of these larger cycles going on. But it is interesting too that we're coming into this Venus retrograde in Scorpio on the back of that Mars retrograde. So to have, these sort of two strong retrogrades, and both Venus and Mars in different ways speak to sexual energy, sexual experiences, and the masculine and feminine dance, if you like. So I know collectively there's been some really difficult topics that have been brought out into the open this year, but it seems to be very resonant with what the skies are asking us to be reflecting on and questioning whether we want more of this or we want less of this, or we want to change something. And that's ultimately, whether you think collectively or individually, the process of a retrograde is that process of alchemical transformation.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, if we think about it and we're looking at Venus in Scorpio and we're thinking about Uranus in Taurus, there's it's uncomfortable. This is uncomfortable to talk about, within, one-on-one, within the sphere of the world. Like, this is the thing, is it's kind of shaking that out and that vulnerability out so that we can be uncomfortable to actually talk about these things for a moment, so that, we're never going to move past something, or cultivate a higher worth of something, if we want to think about Venus, until we address the issues, basically. So I just found it very, it was kind of perfect. And then to think of her coming back into Libra. So she's going to retrograde back into Libra.
Yes.
And here we are, we're talking about hearings and court hearings. It's very, Libran. So, I mean, what is your take on Venus in one of her signs?
Yeah, I do think it changes the Venus retrograde vibe. I think the justice piece, we get a bit of a continuing thread there, because Jupiter has a lot to do with justice. So to have Venus retrograde in the same sign as Jupiter for a period, and then to have Venus retrograde in the sign of Libra for another portion, we have got these themes about the legalities and the court cases and the justice system, if you like, coming through. So there's those things, but yeah, the tenor or the tone, Venus retrograde in Scorpio versus Venus retrograde in Libra, completely different. Chalk and cheese, basically, chalk and cheese. And so I'm actually really looking forward to November. It's one of my kind of highlight months for 2018, partly because Jupiter goes into Sag, but I do think there is an opportunity to be more expressive with Venus retrograde in Libra. And Venus backtracks into Libra on the night of October 31st. So basically we'll have the Halloween, Samhain celebration, I should say, Beltane if you're in Australia, and that crossing of that threshold mirrors the Venus backtracking into Libra. So it's not that the reassessment of relationship, that doesn't go away, but it takes on a different tone. There's maybe less rawness or less kind of deal with the uncomfortable part. That's more of the Venus in Scorpio portion. But Venus in Libra is the collaboration, or the how can we compromise? How can we find maybe a workable solution? Where are we going to go forward, or how do we move forward based on all the digging we've just done? Because I do think Venus retrograde in Scorpio, the image that comes to mind is like digging, and you're digging up all sorts of stuff. You don't know what's been buried in the garden, where the skeletons are, or where the buried treasure is, and you've got to go and dig for it all. And you've got to find a mix of both. You've got to find some skeletons and some buried treasure. And that's symbolically, that's what you're doing in your psyche. You're like, oh my God, that skeleton, that debris or that toxic gunk from a previous betrayal or broken trust, or, where you were wounded, or you're carrying the pain. And the Ford hearings are a really great example of that, because we can't really say why she's chosen to speak out now. It's wonderful that she has, but she is obviously had to really fight something inside of her to be so vocal and expressive about a pain that she has carried inside her for such a long time. And we may or may not have experiences on the same scale of what she has been through, but we all have these experiences where we have felt betrayed or not good enough or taken advantage of or dominated in a situation that made us feel uncomfortable. And it's the Venus in retrograde in Scorpio is processing all of that. Whereas the Venus retrograde in Libra, for some people, it will be about seeking justice or seeking to rebalance the scales. And that may happen through the legal system. It may happen just in our personal lives, where we realize we need to address something with someone that we've let fester for too long. But I think that it does feel lighter, but it's more about expressive discussion, like talking about it, and really getting all the different pieces together and pulling some sort of context out of it.
Yeah, like maybe part of the retrograde through Scorpio is digging up the grievance and then airing it out basically once it hits into Libra, where we're like we decide, we're like, okay, we got to talk this out. I got to present my case. You present your case. Let's meet in the middle. How are we going to make
Yes. Yeah. And that's what I think the Venus retro in Libra is. And it's about 2 weeks, because I think Venus, off the top of my head, she stations direct around the 14th or 15th of November, and she's come all the way back. Oh, 16th. Yeah.
At least
and she's
my code
on the Pacific. Yes. Yeah. It's so tricky. So we'll say 16th, 17th, because that'll cover our different time zones.
Yes.
And she'll be back at 25 Libra. So she is going to station direct very close to the fixed star Speaker or Spiker, which is a star about knowledge and wisdom. And so there is sort of that's why I think this Venus retrograde is really building into a revelation of sorts. We gather, whether it's just a piece of self-awareness or self-knowledge, or we gather some understanding that puts into context an external experience. But it's a really rich process if you're prepared to sit in the gunk a little bit.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so I wanted to talk about the shadow period a little bit, but I think I almost think I want to talk about more about how, the last time Venus retrograde.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I think that would probably be
because it seems to segue through that. Yeah. And I mean, before we discuss it, part of that lies in the fact that Venus and its retrograde cycle, she has a very beautiful pattern that she makes, right? How she does the dance, and why every 8 years we revisit a certain sign in a spot.
Yes.
So shall we talk a little bit about that? Just
Yes, we absolutely should. I actually realized I might have a visual that we could throw up on this. I don't know if I can get the screen from you to throw it up.
I wish I was a little more
oh, hang on. I might just be able to do
savvy
it.
with some of this.
No, I got it. Here we go.
You got it?
Can you see that on the screen?
I do.
Okay, so this is the 5-pointed star, the pentagram, I think is the technical name, but someone correct me if I've got that wrong.
I think it's also the pentangle.
Pentangle, yeah.
I think it can be either one.
Okay, yeah. I mean, the key is it's got 5 points.
Yes.
And because Venus does retrograde basically just in 5 places in the zodiac. And if you connect the dots between those 5 points that she has her retrogrades, you do end up with this beautiful 5-pointed star. So this is considered to be a Venusian symbol, if you like. And the tracing of her retrograde cycle through the heavens, that's something that, going back to the ancient Babylonians, they looked at. And so this is a cycle that people have studied since antiquity. And it takes Venus about 8 years to return to the retrograde in the same sign, essentially. And so, yeah, we've got Venus retrograde in Scorpio. She's going to start her retrograde about 10 Scorpio in October 2018, which means that 8 years ago, October 2010, Venus would have started her retrograde about 12 degrees of Scorpio. So it kind of just moves back by a couple of degrees, but it's definitely in very close to that same point in the same sign. So this sets up the 8-year pattern of Venus retrograde cycles. I know Venus goes retrograde every 18 months, but you really see the energetic resonance from 8 years to 8 years. And so that, like, really September, October, November 2010, you can cast your mind back to events and circumstances and even people that were really significant in your life at that point. And you will notice a resonance now, September, October, November 2018. And the other way to think, so sometimes it's about resolving or clearing things that started back then. Other times things got neglected back then that you might want to resurrect or reactivate. But the other way to think about it too is that this period, late 2010 and late 2018, is like bookended. It's a chapter in your life that kind of is coming full circle. And so thinking back, yeah, where was I in 2010? What was I doing? What was happening? How have I moved on from that? Am I still stuck in those things in some ways? Because one of the things I do think Venus in Scorpio, Venus retrograde in Scorpio is good for is the purge and purify, the releasing of things that are festering or aren't flowing smoothly. A physical symptom in health astrology that's often connected to Scorpio is constipation. And not that I'm suggesting we're all about to get constipated necessarily, but I feel like it's in Scorpio with Venus there, it's a little bit more of like an emotional or an energetic stuckness. And so being aware of where the blockage might be and then attending to what is going to clear things out. So there may be some decluttering or purging, but it's somehow tied to or reflective of events from that late 2010 period.
Yeah. And you know, what's funny is luckily, Kelly, I started to journal around that time, and I've been journaling ever since. So before I thought I would take a look. I thought I would take a look and see what was going on. I was actually surprised at all the stuff that was going on. So I have some personal things, and then I also have like a worldly event that I thought was interesting.
Lovely, yes.
So personally, some little key points to hit on. Apparently that was a very active time in my life. Well, I was in a relationship that was on and off and not necessarily going well. And I was actually dealing with some jealousy or like envy of an ex of the person. And you know how Scorpio is that. And very, Scorpio rising, you know, let's not pretend as people with Scorpio energy, we have to deal with some of these things. It's par for the course. Yes. And so there was that going on. There was that was the time I had my first yoga lesson. Out of, you know, and it's, keep in mind, this is my house, you know, if I'm Scorpio rising. And so the body, you're taking care of the body. And I you know, not consistently, but I've been doing yoga ever since on some level.
Excellent.
I had lived by myself for a very long time, and I opened my house to roommates at that time, which is
Wow.
also interesting, you know, being a Cancer from maybe a solar perspective, retrograding back into Libra, which is fourth house for, you know, Cancer, a Cancer setup there. So that was interesting. And two more things that were probably one of the most significant. Yeah, see, very active. I don't know what was going on here. So one thing was I discovered, I had a dream about some pens and some paper. And it was such a poignant dream that I decided to go buy the color pens and some paper and just do something. Like, I didn't know what I was going to do. And I ended up starting to create some artwork, like this mosaic pen type of drawing. I've never drawn in my life. It's like I unearthed some type of hidden treasure that was there. And then for a period of time, all of a sudden I was this artist making these crazy things I had no idea that I had in me, you know?
Wow.
And
I love that.
it was cool, and that was a fun thing to look back upon, that was there, and it was also a time where I was having energetically this thing over my head where I could feel it. I just felt energy over my head, and I went to this like this psychic reading place where they every Monday or every first Monday of the month, they would have people come in. They're like training their psychics, basically.
Yes.
And that was a way to bring the public in and just, you know. And so I asked them about it. And all they said was they saw my name in lights, and that I had to pursue my spiritual path, because that was basically what was being born in me right now. This is the time that I started to do all the, you know, tarot, astrology. This is also the time that I decided to do my bands when I got into music. And, you know, I was playing in a band at that time where I reassessed during the retrograde of whether or not I wanted to put my time into that or do my own band.
Oh my goodness.
And so that's enough. But that's plenty. Isn't that crazy?
It's like so much symbolism. I mean, you've got the arts and the creativity. So, I mean, Venus is about how we make things beautiful or how we add beauty to the world. And so it was in your first house. It was very literal about your own creativity. And then the body stuff with yoga, I think that's fantastic. And then the writing with the books and the papers and the drawing and the pens and pencils. I mean, it is just really interesting. And I'm like, okay, well, we need more of that. Like, how can you take that to the next level this time around?
Exactly. And that's kind of what we're saying here is if we look back to that, you know, period 8 years ago, it's giving us some insight into, you know, where the story might pick back up.
Yes. And so this is actually a really good tip, because even if you don't know your chart that well, you will know that you will be able to remember what was happening in your life in that late 2010 period. And so if all you do is connect the dots between what you tried to get going then or what you dabbled in then that maybe you can take to another level now, that's how simple working with some of these cycles can be. And I think the other point that just occurred to me when you were talking there, Mel, the last time we had the Venus retro in Scorp, actually Jupiter has not been back. Like this is the only time Jupiter's been in Scorpio since then. So there is sort of it's almost like there may be some latent stuff or neglected stuff from that time that Jupiter in Scorpio has been awakening since October 2017. And that can be really brought into fruition through October, because October's got this really unique energy because that's when Venus is retro in Scorpio only, basically. And we have the last full month of Jupiter in Scorpio.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I love that. The art, the beauty, and then your home. Like, do I share my home with people or do I not?
Yeah. And I was having conflicting feelings as I was, you know, getting it prepped and ready. And I was switching rooms. I was moving from room to room in my house. And,
yes,
you know, which was funny because I actually ended up saving a lot of money. I went from paying for everything to paying for a very little amount. And so that was good. That was nice.
Yes.
But you know what I found?
Which I think it's good that you share that, Mel, because I think some people really worry about Venus retrograde as being a bad thing. I mean, and you've said there that you made some changes and there were some improvements and benefits. And I think that's the whole point. When we have to make changes, it's not just to stress us out and make us anxious. The whole point of change is to get to a place that is somehow better for you. And there's some really good examples there.
Well, if we liken it back to the idea of opening up, opening
Yes.
up to change, you know, it wasn't that the change was going to be bad. I just had to go through the process of where I opened myself up to it.
Yes.
And you don't know until you live it out, basically. You just got to roll with the punches and be receptive to what it is that you encounter. But I found it very interesting just to play off of our Ford and Kavanaugh discussion that's going on now.
Yeah.
During the retrograde back in 2010, that's when the California judge it ordered the government to stop enforcing the don't ask, don't tell in the military. And for people that were serving in the military that were like had to keep a secret. It didn't pan out. It had its issues through the retrograde and just over time. But I just thought that was interesting that is another type of facet that came up during that last retrograde, at least on a political level.
Absolutely. And I think that's so key, because we shouldn't really kind of shy away from the idea that Venus in Scorpio is very much about sexuality, and it's about, can we be open about our sexuality? Can we not be open? And so I think a lot of us, whether there are larger issues connected to your sexuality and your sexual freedoms or not, this experience is really about looking to create more integration, but also more integrity around that. And so it's no surprise that there was such a big ruling, if you like, around that don't ask, don't tell policy. So it was repealed at that time.
It was what it was Judge Virginia Phillips of California ordered the government to stop enforcing the don't ask, don't tell.
Right. Okay. Okay.
Which basically, it forbid gays and lesbians from openly serving in the military. It's basically like you can be part of the military, but you can't be yourself. Which, talking about integrity, that doesn't really work out too well. But it was fought, and the ban, they put it out there, but of course the Federal Appeals Court temporarily stalled it on, we're talking about retrograde there, make that decision. So it took a while for that, back and forth, but regardless, the very topic itself was brought up, and it was brought up in a way that had to do, we're talking about a judge. We're once again talking about the courts and stuff along those lines. So I thought that was interesting.
Absolutely. And there's so much in the collective conversation at the moment about sexuality that I think we're just going to see more and more of this coming through. I mean, Scorpio is a sign where secrets are kept and things are buried deeply and buried, into extreme darkness. And when we have a bright planet like Venus go into Scorpio, we are getting that sense of a light coming into the darkness, which means we're starting to shine a light on or see things or hear about things that might have been hidden to us previously, or that we might have just been oblivious to, and now we get awakened to.
I like that. So, all right. So we don't go too long here. I do want to throw in real quick with the shadow period, the idea that Venus retrograde's happening from October 5th to, or 6th, depending on where you are in the world, to November 16th or 17th. But we have that shadow period that started back in early September 2nd, and it goes through December 16th. So you have any quick words and, why isn't it over yet? Why does it start early?
Totally. I mean, most of it comes down from understanding how we experience the planets moving in the sky. And just like if you're in your car, even if you hit the brakes, it takes a little while for the car to actually stop. And that's what's happening in the shadow period before the retrograde. Venus has symbolically hit the brake, so she is slowing down. And then in the post-retrograde period, she's starting to go faster. She's building up to her normal speed, but it takes her a little while to get there. So that's part of the piece. But the other component is that the period in the sky, the zodiac, if you like, from 25 Libra to 10 Scorpio, that's where Venus will retrograde. She moves through that period first in a direct motion. It's slowing down. Then she hits her retrograde, and then she backtracks through that same part of the sky, ends her retrograde, and finally comes back through for a third time over that same part of the zodiac. And the shadow period are those direct passages that happen immediately before and after the retrograde. And they're significant because they are the pre-retrograde shadow is like the preview or the preparation. And so when we talk about Venus going retrograde on October 5th, you already have a sense of the territory or the topics that you're going to be diving into, because they're the stuff that you were just dealing with in the 3 or 4 weeks leading up to that, while Venus went forward but slowly over that particular part of the zodiac. Then she retrogrades back and it's like, let's dive in, let's pull all these things apart, let's, dig up the backyard, proverbially speaking. Then, we're going forward at the end there, and she is still going over that same territory. That's why it's such an intense period. 3 passages of Venus over the same part of the sky. That's unusual. And that's why if you have planets or you have an angle, like your ascendant or your midheaven at late Libra, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, Libra, or 0 to 10 Scorpio, Venus is going back and forward. So you can't make one choice and be done with it. You've got to make your choice, try it out, reassess, go again, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So the shadow period does set up, it extends the time frame of the retrograde, if you like, but it gives you a more complete picture of what's actually going on during that retrograde time.
Perfect. Yes. Yeah. So the shadow is very important because, like Kelly said, we're backing up, we're moving forward. Like we're just revisiting it over and over. And essentially that's what's going on. So, what have we learned here? Do you have any closing, food for thought or a tip around working with Venus retrograde? I know we talked about one briefly earlier.
Yeah, I do. I always think about, 40 days in the desert with Venus retrograde. So I do think about creating some sort of, 6-week or 40-day type of ritual that is about maybe giving something up, like, going on a little bit of a, not a deprivation thing, but it's almost like you want, to take some of the Venus out of your life, and then you get more thoughtful about what types of Venus you want to add back in. Like if you eat too much sweets, this can be a good time to think about cutting back. If you think that you're spending too much frivolously, this can be a good time to think about cutting back. You want to question the pleasure principle for you. And I think the larger theme is that less is more. So less larger group events, more smaller, intimate events, less doing for others. A little bit of a tagline I have here is that it's a time to kind of reconnect with and express your desires rather than dealing with duties all the time. And so the reflection will be so critical to help you with that.
Yes. Oh, I love it, Kelly. Thank you so much for sharing all this wonderful knowledge. You have a lot of knowledge to share, and I know you do many things. So tell people where they can find you, if you have courses going on and all that stuff.
Yeah, well, funnily enough, I have 2 things going on late October. We've got my next online astrology class, which is on relationship astrology. Oh. And that'll start, I know I kind of just, you have to fit things into the schedule. And I was like, oh, that'll be nice to do when Venus is retro.
Perfect.
So that's, the live classes are Monday nights, Eastern time. And the class starts on October 29th. If you can't make the live class, that's absolutely fine. Everybody gets access to the online portal, and you'll get video downloads, and everybody gets the reading, the homework exercises, the class discussions. So that'll start October 29, and there'll be 4 sessions. So that'll finish up just before the Thanksgiving weekend for everyone in the States. And the other big event, actually, I've probably got a few, but I'll limit it. We've got
full schedule, Kelly. Full schedule.
Full schedule. Yeah, there's always a lot, but I love it. I mean, it's such a joy. Astrology University is hosting a summit, an astrology summit on destiny and the birth chart and astrology and figuring out who you are. And that's actually the last weekend in October. So October 27th and 28th. Registration for both my 4-week relationship astrology class and the astrology summit is open now. And you can find info about both of those things via my website, which is kellysastrology.com. And you can also follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. I'm much better on Twitter than anything else because I definitely am a words girl, but I'm learning more about how to get those words onto Instagram. But I look forward to connecting with people out in the internet land.
Perfect. And if any of you missed that, I will also have all those things on my blog too, so that, you know, you'll be directed in the right direction, because I highly recommend studying with Kelly, because she has a practical application to things that could, you know, I don't know, it's just the way my mind works, and I found it very helpful to study with you. So recommend it.
Thank you.
So where can you find me? Well, you can find me at energeticprinciples.com, and also on Instagram and Facebook, where I'm more active on the Instagram. I'm a pictures person.
Yes. It's interesting, isn't it? Like, I realized in the beginning, why do I like Twitter so much? I'm like, I'm such a word nerd.
Yeah.
And then I have these beautiful creative people like yourself, Mel, who are so much more visual. And I just think it's lovely how people kind of go to where they naturally feel comfortable.
Yeah. Well, luckily there's a platform for us all. So that's
true. Yes.
So you can find me there at Energetic Principles. All's the same there. And if you're interested in helping to support and appreciate the podcast, I am on Patreon, where I do bi-monthly moon horoscopes, and also my tarot subscription, which is a weekly tarot spread that I offer. So you can check that out at patreon.com/energetic principles. And if you like what you heard here today, you know, share it with a friend, spread the good word, you know, help us, you know, get astrology out there.
5 stars on iTunes.
Kelly said it. I didn't say it, but I'll back her. Yes, because it helps.
It does make a difference. It really makes a difference.
It really does. And I have gotten some recently. So thank you for anybody that has done it, because, you know, sometimes you don't have to say anything. You just click 5 stars and that's it. So for those of you who've done that, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. So once again, thank you so much for joining me, Kelly. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Mel. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. All right. And thank you so much for tuning in. And as always, may the stars be with you.